The Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies turns 20 this academic year. The first conference we convened was held here in Oxford, Ohio in March 2001 on the theme of imagining Russia. A number of prominent scholars came to campus to talk about the state of the field, and we imagined the field very broadly at the time. And we thought we'd use our 20th anniversary in 2020 to reimagine what we know. One of the guests at that first conference was Joan Neuberger, professor of history at the University of Texas, and I'm delighted that she joins us again. And I'm also extremely pleased to welcome Maria Belodubrovskaya, associate professor in the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. Both Joan and Maria are noted scholars of Soviet cinema, Stalinist era cinema even more specifically. Maria's book, Not According to Plan, Filmmaking Under Stalin, appeared with Cornell University Press in 2017, while Joan's award-winning This Thing of Darkness, Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible in Stalin's Russia, appeared last year with Cornell University Press. Both are working on new projects about Stalinist era cinema, so that's going to be the subject we discuss today. And I'll start by saying, the tendency that I think you both pick up on in your works is to view Stalinist cinema is, well, as Stalinist. That is to say, the Soviet dictator was critic number one. The state he oversaw was extremely repressive, even toward culture. And what struck me in both of your books is that you both delve deeply into the process of filmmaking under Stalin, taking the reader inside of meetings, into the way collaborations work, into the art of filmmaking in this period, and how it did not always follow the state's dictates. So tell us a little bit more about what you discovered by adopting this focus. Maybe we'll start with Joan.
Some of the things that really surprised me were the ways that socialist realism worked as a system. So in 1932, it was announced that there would be a state organized, state-planned set of priorities for the arts. And in 1934 and 35, they began implementing these. And our as Masha points out in her book, our sort of standard view of all this was that everything came from the top down. But it's been clear for a long time that there was a lot of negotiations. So the things that were interesting to me were the ways those negotiations took place between filmmakers and the state. And it was complicated. The thing that really stood out to me was that people have often looked at the genres, right, and sort of looked at narratives and thought that socialist realism was really all about the stories that people had to tell. But what really stood out to me was the institutions that were created in order to enforce socialist realism. So the various hierarchies that were created to try and make sure that filmmakers made ideologically acceptable films. I could go on, but I know Masha has stuff to say.
Yeah, no, I want to hear Masha's point too, yeah.
So my starting point was that, so again, I came to this project with the same assumptions, but pretty early about Stalin being in control and it being Stalinist cinema, it being propaganda cinema. What I realized very early, and the reason I started the project, was that the films don't look Stalinist to me. Ivan the Terrible is a prime example. That wasn't what I started with, but clearly, if you have Ivan the Terrible made in Russia at this time, they cannot possibly have been controlled by Stalin. There's some disconnect between the idea of policy, ideology, and Stalin, and the actual films that were produced. And because what sits in between Stalin policymaking and the films, well, there are two things that sit in between: production process and people who make the films. So that's why my book was dedicated to what were institutions of film production, right? Planning, censorship, screenwriting, directing, and who were the people that were actually making the decisions, that is administrators, censors, and of course, most importantly, and I think that's the most important institution that made the disconnect possible between what Stalin wants and what Stalin gets, is the directors who make the films. And so if you look at, you kind of open it up, like open that middle ground up and try to figure out what was going on the ground, what the institutions were, what was actually possible, you understand why what Stalin wanted, or what, your imaginary typical censor wanted, never actually happened, or happened with problems, or happened with handicaps, and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where we differ a little bit, because I think what Masha found in her study was the way institutions work, and the incredibly complicated way in which those negotiations took place. But ultimately, the form of those negotiations was ultimately always decided by the knowledge that Stalin had the last word. And so all throughout the process, even though there was a certain amount of freedom for filmmakers and filmmaking administrators to make decisions and to push the envelope, to push the boundaries of what social surrealist film could be, all along the way, people made decisions knowing that Stalin had the final word. So for me, the most important thing that produced was a system in which people made decisions. People often made negative decisions about screenplays, about rushes, about ultimate film productions, finished films, that often tended to be more negative than positive, because they always knew that someone above them could make a negative decision and say, well, Stalin isn't going to like this. And if I actually let a film or a screenplay or even a scene go through and approve it, then I'm the one who could get in trouble. And so all along, this process is shadowed by Stalin, even if he isn't making those, even if he isn't determining what kind of films are going to be made. And that for me was like sort of the main operative process that I saw. And there are all sorts of ways in which that was adapted. So both of us talk about the system of patronage, which I found completely fascinating. I mean, Sheila Fitzpatrick had talked about patronage. A lot of political scientists had talked about patronage in the Soviet system, but to see it work in the film world was really fascinating. Here you have Eisenstein, as Masha pointed out. Here you have Eisenstein making this incredibly transgressive film. I mean, I don't think it's really representative of the period. It's because it's so transgressive and so critical of the regime, but. He constantly was appealing to the head of the cinema industry, Ivan Bolshakov, or directly to Stalin, to kind of work around roadblocks that got in his way. So he was constantly appealing to his patrons, who he knew had to support him in some way in order to deal with other people who were putting up roadblocks. And that was really fascinating to me too.
Okay, so I would say I have two ways in which you can think about it differently. One is that there actually were situations when Stalin liked something. So I completely agree that they all think Stalin is up there and that they're self-censoring like crazy. However, there are situations when Stalin reverses the decision by all the censors made before, right? And so that is, the point is, in the system we're trying to describe, there is a possibility when Stalin says, no, it's perfectly fine, this film is perfectly fine. So one example is 1934, the Alexandra film, Grigory Alexander's films, Jolly Fellows, where everyone in the hierarchy, and this is, people who read screenplays at studios, people who censor screenplays at the level of film administration, screenplays and films, and even the agitprop, right? So the propaganda department within the central committee that is in charge of looking at films at that point, there's a special commission. They say, this is horrible. You cannot possibly show it to the people. You cannot possibly send it to the international film festivals. It is a terrible film. We can't possibly show it. And Stalin says, I love it. And it gets released and it becomes this big celebratory, it becomes this big thing. So that did happen. Everyone in the industry knows that. And so given that that opening is out there, or this another example is of course with Eisenstein and what happens to him after Bejin Meadow, his 1937 film is banned. The Bejin Meadow is banned. And Boris Shumyatsky, the head of the film industry or the film administration, writes to Stalin saying, this just shows you, basically, I'm not quoting, this just shows you that Eisenstein is not one of us. He's not a Soviet artist. He cannot make a Soviet film. He shouldn't be allowed to make Soviet films. And what does Stalin say? Stalin say, no, let him pick a film, give him some options, let him pick a film and let him work, right? And so that's when Eisenstein makes Alexander Nevsky because they give him some options, and he picks the option that goes farther into history, farther away, because you can make more, nobody knows that much about Alexander Nevsky, so I'm going to make a film that there's less known, so I have more choices there. So there are a couple of times when Stalin does make those things, and that's where when that is possible, then anything is possible. Even though, of course, I agree that everything is going towards this way, but Stalin is going to see it, and we need to keep that in mind, and we have to self-censor. The other thing that I would say is it is true.
Masha, I mean, I think that what you've just been saying actually supports the argument that I'm making, which is that everyone pushed as far as they could, and there was a constant process of negotiation, but they also always understood that the final decision was going to be made by Stalin. So of course there were opportunities where, there were situations where the whole system was unpredictable. And for Stalin, that made it that much more appealing to him. Socialist realism from the beginning was never clearly defined, so that, and this was a form of Stalinist control. If you said exactly what needed to be present in any socialist realist work, then people would know what to include and what to exclude. But by leaving it vague, that was a way that no one knew what Stalin was going to decide ultimately. And so that gave them some freedom to push the boundaries, but it also gave them a lot of worry about what was going to happen if they made the wrong choice.
Sure, I agree with that.
It was really, it was literally life-threatening for people.
Yeah, I agree with that, but we have Ivan the Terrible as a result.
Ivan the Terrible is an exception.
And many other wonderful
and it was made in evacuation, which clearly gave Eisenstein some freedom to make the film the way he wanted to make it. But also only part one was accepted, right? Part two was not. So you can argue that it was a success, and you can argue that it was a failure. You can argue that it was a Stalinist film. You can argue that it was the opposite of a Stalinist film. And I think that it's a really good example of just how it's more the shadow of Stalin than the actual decisions that shape the way filmmakers worked.
I'm struck that that's part of the artistic process, though, that I think filmmakers living in the Stalin era came to embrace. I'm also reminded of the fact that many filmmakers, when the Soviet Union collapsed, said that they initially missed the censorship in general, or the perceived threat of censorship, because they felt like having that hanging over them helped them make something more artistic, which is something you guys are arguing about, I suppose, which is good. I actually just had a class yesterday on oral history, and one of the cardinal rules of oral history is that the interviewer doesn't want to spend more time than the interviewee. So that it's great that I'm not. If I could ask a follow-up question to Masha and then one to Joan, so that because you've talked about success or failure, as you just said, Joan, and it's hard to kind of characterize Ivan the Terrible using these terms. But Masha, you say in your book that the Stalinist film industry failed to establish a communist film industry. So maybe you can explain that term a little more, and that conclusion a little more.
That is simply kind of an argument. It's an argument about quantity and quality, right? I argue that, and I see that throughout, like it's not something that I bring to this. It's something that you see throughout the literature, is that what they wanted was mass production, right? They wanted what, some could term Soviet Hollywood, and they made some attempts to establish Soviet Hollywood. And Soviet Hollywood, to me, means numbers. They always wanted 500 films. At some point, there's 1,000 films a year. And so if you look at kind of what we can imagine would have happened, which is a fully controlled mass production of propaganda films, of at least 100 a year. That's not what happened, because by the end they're producing fewer and fewer every year. It goes to 40 to 30 to 20, and by the end of the Stalin period is in only dozen films are produced. And so if you consider like Stalin is in control and he wants a mass production, mass distribution of films, they didn't get that. So that's one argument, is that simply in terms of mass production, that never happened. And the second argument is, this is related to what we just talked about, which is what the films were actually like. And my argument is simply that it wasn't just propaganda. These were artistically accomplished films. And they were, some of them or some parts of them were normal genre films that could be distributed in the West and watched by people. And so they never made a fully socialist realist, fully controlled, fully propagandistic films, right? And so to me, quality-wise, like in terms of what the films were like, that was not a full success from the point of view of what Stalin ideally imagined, I would imagine it to be. Yeah, and I can talk about why that happened too.
Well, it's a good segue to a question I was going to ask Joan, which is you alluded to earlier, Joan, that it's hard to describe the Ivan the Terrible films as successes or failures in the ways the state wanted them to be, which is one of the major corrections that I think you do in your book. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the misperceptions we have of Ivan the Terrible, part 1 versus part 2. There seems to be a way that you describe in the book that most people think about Ivan the Terrible part 1, and then most people think about Ivan the Terrible part 2, one being Stalinist, one not, one being more transgressive. So describe this a little more and fill in the details of this success failure misperception.
Sure. I mean, so it's an incredibly complicated story. The whole story is incredibly complicated. But there's no question. I mean, this is sort of an old debate. And the reason is because part 1 came out at the end of 1944, 1945. And then it won the Stalin Prize. And so that made it look like everyone understood that this was a pro-Stalin film and that the image of Ivan justified Stalin's centralization of power and the violence of the terror. And then part 2 was immediately banned right afterwards and wasn't really seen. So that was in 1946 and wasn't really seen until 1958. And in 1958, when people saw it, it looked so anti-Stalinist and so critical of the violence of the regime. And Ivan himself is constantly asking God and the audience and everyone else if he was doing the right thing, rather than being resolute, which is what Stalin wanted, resolute about killing people. And so, arose this idea arose that part 1 was pro-Stalin and that Eisenstein realized he decided for some reason to go and make part 2 more critical. But in fact, he wrote the whole screenplay as one thing. He was worried, in fact, that part 1 would be perceived as being too tame, but it was really what he thought of as being the sort of setup for everything that was to come later, sort of laying the ground for the psychologically understanding the role of despotism and the role of violence. Yeah, so in fact, it's really, really one film, but he also, so the way he made it and the way he managed to get part 1 accepted was to create a kind of surface narrative, which looks just like a sort of ordinary socialist realist narrative where, a young ruler lays out his progressive platform, then there are lots of people who oppose it. And that young ruler then overcomes those obstacles and is successful. Of course, part 1 ends with Ivan having to abdicate and trick the people into coming and ask him to come back to Moscow and rule. So, it's already in, and there's a lot of ways in which Eisenstein undermines that narrative throughout part 1, which become clear if you start looking into it and also look at what he wrote about it. Might not be clear, it's not always clear to my students when they watch it. Most of my students are as bewildered as Soviet audiences were about Ivan, like, why is he so weird and what's with the beard and the weird hair and why does he have that cross around his neck? Like, I thought religion, I thought the Soviet Union was atheistic and so on. So there are all sorts of ways in which Eisenstein complicates the portrait of Ivan even in part 1, but you have to be willing to look into it to see them. I mean, it's easy to be sort of fooled. Western audiences were completely fooled by that and saw it just as a propaganda piece. So you could write a whole book as long as my book about the reception of Ivan the Terrible from 1944 until the present. It's complicated.
I'll admit I was fooled too when I first saw it, and in fact was until I read your book. And you alluded, Joan, to the fact that you have to look into it, and that seems like a perfect segue to another question. What?
Yeah, that always seemed really surprising to me because when I saw it, I thought, well, this is a really weird portrait of someone who's supposed to represent Stalin. This does not work. And that was just looking at part one, but it's so many people, you know, see it. And partly because that's what we expect to see. He starts out with credits that tell you exactly what to see. And that really shapes, we all see what we expect to see, and that he does a good job of sort of setting up those expectations and then undermining them.
Right, and there seems to be a perception that just because something won the Stalin Prize, that it's therefore propagandistic. I'm thinking too, you know, like of Vasily Grossman's initial novel, the Basis of Stalingrad, won a Stalin Prize. That doesn't mean it's bad or even propagandistic. But you know, part of the way you both correct misperceptions about Stalinist era cinema is because you both have done so much deep archival work and immersed yourself in archival materials. When you said, Joan, just a minute ago, you know, when you start investigating Eisenstein's process in making both films, you learn a lot more because, of course, you gain access to the things he wrote, and you learn a lot more about the process of filmmaking and the director and the collaborations, the patron-client relations as well. So I'm curious, what are some of the most surprising and interesting or even disturbing archival finds you both made while researching your books? Maybe start this time with Masha.
Yeah, so there are two myths about Stalinist cinema that I discovered were not true when working at the archives. So one myth comes from the idea that Stalin was the general producer or the general censor of this system, and it is based on the idea that he read the screenplays of Soviet films. Like, we all know he watched the films, but I argue there's a difference between reading the screenplay and watching the final product, because you can do a lot less at the end of the process, a lot more on the screenplay stage. And this idea that Stalin was this controlling presence, reading all the screenplays, comes from Grigory Maryamov's book from 1992 called Kremlevsky Censor, or the Kremlin Censor. I mean, the title is that Stalin is the censor. And what I discovered is that I actually looked at all the screenplays that Stalin read. First of all, there are very few. There are a dozen only, okay? And the second is what kind of comments Stalin made on these screenplays. So I'll just give you one astonishing example. So he read a screenplay for a film called The Viborg Side, Vyborgskaya Strana from 1938, directed by Kozintsev and Trauberg. And there are two changes in the screenplay on pages 15 and pages 67. And the changes are change the name Kuba to Stalin. That's it. And all of these screenplays have this kind of correction. Either there's nothing or very, very, very limited marginalia. There's nothing is crossed out and so on, right? So to say that Stalin was a control of Soviet screenwriting directly, it is so not true. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is, one other myth is this myth of thematic planning, right? The idea that because there was such a thing as thematic planning, themes or subject matter of Soviet films were given to screenwriters and directors to make. And that is totally not the case. From 1932 on and through the 50s, and I looked at the documents of how thematic plans were compiled, what they were compiled out of, where the projects came from. They came from bottom up. They came from the studios, and at the studios, they came from the directors. So it's something that screenwriters themselves brought to the studio, directors themselves wanted to make. These are proposals from the creative workers. That's what went into a plan, because they realized pretty early on that if they assign to a studio, a screenwriter, a film about like the chemical industry or something like that, people can't write and can write on that. So they will only work on whatever they can work on. So it's actually a bottom-up system. And to say that, you could say that they were self-censoring. They could say that they were trying to satisfy Stalin or whatever, but still it comes from the creative workers themselves. And that's, I think, is a difference. So
that's fascinating. Joan, there's so many possibilities with Eisenstein. So tell us a couple of the finds you made that really surprised you, disturbed you, interested you the most.
Well, the first thing I discovered was that Eisenstein's private writings are quite different from his public writings. And the public writings are very coy and sort of bombastic, I think, and difficult. And his private writings, his diaries, and he kept over 100 notebooks about reading and his thoughts about what he was reading and his thoughts about how to make this film. And they're just passionate intellectual work, really active responses to things he was reading, and thinking about conversations he had with the actors, conversations he had with his friends about how to make the film, about what he wanted to make. So that was the first thing. The other thing is he's very, very cautious. So even in his diaries, even in his private diaries, he doesn't write very much about Stalin. He mentions Stalin maybe 3 times in this voluminous archive. And when he does, it's usually kind of coded and it's about something else. So he has a long, long section on the Stalinist slogan, socialist informed nationalist and nationalist informed socialist in content. And it's a fascinating piece. It ends up in his work Method, which wasn't published in his lifetime. But he just has a little satirical thing about it a little satirical note in his notes. The other thing that I found really fascinating is that a lot of his notes for Ivan the Terrible and his responses to ideas about how to make the film be as emotionally effective and intellectually effective at the same time were ideas that came from thinking about how to make the film end up in this big theoretical, his magnum opus Method, which, as I said, wasn't published at the time. Normally, I don't think this is really true anymore, but a lot of early Eisenstein literature would look at the theory and say, this is how he applied it to his films. But it was always a sort of interactive process. And following that, having the ability to follow that from beginning to end through the process of making Ivan the Terrible was really fascinating. And watching the back and forth was just really, really, really fascinating.
Also fascinating to me, and one of my favorite parts in your book, Joan, is how you argue that Eisenstein still managed to create a profound work of art under what were at times pretty extreme circumstances. The fact that Part 2 was made under evacuation, and the whole relationship with Stalin and other people as well. So I guess the question for you, Joan, is why, in other words, is this so? And what is it in Eisenstein's film that's so captivating and beautiful? I know you haven't gotten tired of it yet.
Not everyone agrees with you. In fact, most people at the time have not agreed with you. He was from the very beginning of his career, he was interested in how to have an impact on audiences. From the beginning when he was in theater all the way through his film career. And he from about 1930 on, maybe even earlier, he discovered, he was really interested in the emotional and sort of sensory bodily response to visual stimuli. And so he read psychology, he read about non-intellectual, what at the time were called primitive cultures. He read every kind of work of art to really try and understand what makes great art have an impact on people. And he could have come away with a sort of Hollywood immersive idea, that you sort of create films that replicate realism in some way that draws people in. And we all can think of films that we've gone to see that you just get so immersed in and you end up crying or whatever, being terrified. But he wanted to break that process down into pieces and have the audience actually reconstruct it themselves. So that's what makes it really weird, because you're constantly seeing fragments of things that then you somehow emotionally and intellectually put together over the course of the film. And that was sort of fundamental to his process of thinking about montage, thinking about editing and deconstruction and reconstruction, which turns out, if you think about it, to be a thing that we do no matter what kind of film we watch or book we read or whatever. So I think it's that combination of highly intellectualized cognitive clues that he gives you, And at the same time, his appeal to a kind of primal feeling and sensory experience. And it's not like any other film. So so to some extent, I would say that it's a unique way of reaching audiences. And really, literally, a lot of people don't like it. A lot of people at the time didn't like it. They found it, they missed altogether the sort of emotional appeal, the sensory emotional appeal that he was trying to create. So we were talking about the Stalin Prize earlier. What many people don't realize is that Eisenstein almost didn't win the Stalin Prize. It took a decision at the very top. And Masha has made me realize how important Ivan Bolshakov was, the head of the film industry. But clearly he made the decision at the end in consultation with Stalin, because the committees kept turning it down. So they just found it too cognitive, not Russian, whatever that means. And a lot of people missed, I think, the power of the film. But
have you watched it now more times than Stalin saw Chapayev?
Definitely. We were just talking about that. Yes, I've watched it more times than anything else, except maybe Grey's Anatomy. But
so, Masha, you mentioned earlier just how varied the Stalinist era cinema was. So maybe reframing this question for you, what films from this period do you most admire, artistically or otherwise, and why?
Oh, that's a good question.
So the film that I really like that I write about, there's a censorship case. So I have two censorship cases in the book, the first book. One is Alexander Medvedkin's The Miracle Worker, Chudesnitsa. It's from 1937, and it was censored, very heavily under Boris Shumyatsky. The other case is from 1952. I mean, the film came out in 1952. It's called Brave Men, Smeli Люди, which was censored also within the film industry, what I call the film industry, by under Bolshakov. And the reason that I put these two cases together is I'm trying to say Stalinism is going, 37 is a pretty bad year, but things change, and there's this kind of restrictions are mounting. That's the idea. But the way the two films are censored, 37 and 52, are very similar. Like who censors them, what goes on until they're brought out into the world is very similar. And so the reason I mention this is because both of these films are really fantastic. And Brave Men, which is it's a war film, is just one of my favorite films in general. And it was extremely popular. It was not as popular as Chapayev maybe, but it's kind of a Chapayev type film. And the other thing another film that I would mention is the one I'm working on now. And it was a complete surprise to me. It's a film called Hello Moscow, Здравствуй, Москва, and it's made by Sergei Yutkevich in 1945. John has seen me give talks about this film. And it's a very, very strange film. It's a film concert in a sense that some of it, most of it, not most of it, half of it is you watching numbers on the stage being performed. And that's it. Like you have a stage performance that is being recorded. But at the same time, and underneath it, that's a framing story. There's an embedded story that's about kids that are from institutions for teenagers learning to be professionals, like technicians, that are performing on the stage. And that story is a complete suspenseful, thrilling story about a missing instrument, like a missing accordion. And the story was written by two great screenwriters, Nikolai Erdmann and Mikhail Volpin, who also wrote Volga Volga and some other great films. And it's a fascinating combination of kind of great, thrilling story with this totally socialist, realist, boring concert put in the same film and shot with an incredibly creative way. It's shot in a very creative way. It's like a film noir, really. And so it's a totally incompatible film within itself, but you could see what was possible, or you could see the talent that was actually present in the industry then by looking at this film.
Well, I can't wait to read more about it or see you speak about it. It's always good to end with a note about challenging, interesting, even strange films. And of course, I can't wait to read more from Joan about Eisenstein because she writes about him so well. But Joan, Masha, thank you so much for joining me and helping us reimagine Soviet cinema today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks for having us.